When you talk about minimizing attack surface, I touched on this earlier. It is mainly what you want to do is limit your exposure and give the hacker and the attacker less targets to hit on. So inherently with the API gateway, we get a single point of entry into our system, but we have to make sure that anything else that sits behind the API gateway, like our compute logic, the Lambda servers, DynamoDB, if you have an RDS DB instance, all of those are public, isolated in a VPC in a private subnet. So we need to make sure that that is happening. So this way, if you implement this architecture, then everything else is private. Only you are exposing your API gateway to the public endpoint, and then everything else is basically private within a VPC in the private subnet. Now, there is another additional security that you can incorporate here, and that is the possibility of using a private endpoint for your API gateway. So, your API gateway would not be accessible publicly, and if you just want to use the API within your VPC or within a VPC that you have established through like one of your transit VPCs, then you should definitely consider using a private endpoint, because you don't need to expose your API gateway publicly, and you can just get what you want, get the functionality that you want using the private endpoint. And that is a good example of minimizing your attack surface, because in this case, the API gateway endpoint didn't have to be public because you were accessing it from within only a specific VPC, and you just made it a private endpoint which is available to the VPC. Also, another implementation of minimizing the attack surface is using resource policies on your API gateway. Resource policies are required for private endpoints but are optional for public endpoint. For a public endpoint, you can have a resource policy and you can only allow access to specific AWS accounts or specific IP address ranges. So this is also a good implementation of minimizing your attacks surface, because you know that it would only be accessed by a specific account or specific set of IPs. You are only opening it up to those sources and not to the entire public. So here in this diagram, we're depicting that we have a resource policy that is only allowing source IP this, and we have an external client with the source IP this, and it is able to access the API gateway. Any other source would not be allowed to access the APIs.